Hi, welcome everybody. We are getting into the book today, and we're starting, as promised, with Chapter 3, which deals with occupational versus ordinary morality. And the basic idea is this: we have a tendency to act differently on the job than we do in our everyday lives. If you think about it, we have a certain morality that we follow as we go through our life, a way that we conduct and carry ourselves every day. But we do act differently when we're at work. And a lot of times when you go to a particular job, you're going to be given a code of ethics that you're expected to follow. You're going to have a set of rules that you're expected to follow. Even if you're just going into retail work, there's a basic code of morality that you're expected to follow. There's a certain etiquette about the way that you do things. And so it seems like there is a double standard that comes into play in society. And so we have our ordinary everyday morality and we have our on-the-job morality. The basic question of this chapter has to deal with whether or not that's right. Should there be two separate standards of morality, one that we follow on the job and one that we follow in our everyday life? Or should there be simply one basic rule of ethics that we follow at all times? Now, in this chapter, I'm going to be looking at three specific articles. Now, of course, you're welcome to read the whole chapter if you choose to, but these are the three that I'm going to be focusing on and dealing with in terms of this and also in terms of the exam. So on page 58, you have Lawyers as Professionals, Some Moral Issues from Richard Wasserstrom. At page 69, Albert Carr, Is Business Bluffing Ethical? And at page 72, The Business of Ethics, Norman Chase Gillespie. Before we really get into it, though, there's a little bit of terminology that we want to be familiar with. The first two terms I'm sure you guys are familiar with. One is moral, the other is immoral. Obviously, if you are acting in a moral fashion, it means you're following the basic rules and norms established by society. If you're acting in an immoral way, then you're going against those basic rules and norms. But the term you may not be familiar with is amoral. Amoral means that you stand outside of morality altogether. If you think about animals, for example, we don't consider, most people anyway, do not consider animals to be part of the moral kingdom. They simply act upon their instinct. They're not held accountable. If a lion kills an animal and eats it, we don't say that that lion is immoral for what they did. But if a human being kills perhaps another human being to eat it, we say that person's immoral. We apply a moral standard to the human in a way that we don't to the animals. Well, we could also look at human beings going back in time prior to the creation of the civil society, prior to the creation of the modern state. In the beginning, people lived in an amoral society. They had an absolute right to whatever they desired, to whatever they wanted, and the only thing that stood in their way was their strength and their ability to achieve it. And no one would consider their actions to be moral or immoral. They stood outside of society. And some people have argued that there are certain people even today who still are in that role. Scientists, a lot of times, will try to make that claim that their actions are amoral. You take, for example, the first guy that split the atom. And he would argue that that action of splitting the atom is not a moral action, it's not an immoral action. But rather, it's what we choose to do with that knowledge. That's what provides the moral value. If I use that knowledge of splitting the atom to create an atomic bomb, drop it on a city, and destroy thousands upon thousands of people, then my action is going to have a moral value. If I use that knowledge to create a cheap and efficient energy source for the planet, then that action has a moral value. But the act of splitting the atom itself doesn't have a moral value. It's simply gaining of knowledge. The moral value comes in what you do with that knowledge. And so the scientist would say that their action was an amoral action. And the reason why I talk about this now is because in Wasserstrom's article, he talks about how lawyers are sometimes seen as immoral, but many times people will also say they are amoral. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. The other term that you're going to be introduced to here, and you'll see this one a lot throughout the course, is paternalism. Paternalism, in its paradigm case, comes back to the relationship between the parent and the child. That parent is older and hopefully wiser than the child. Therefore, the parent many times will impose their will upon that child, will force that child to do things against their will because they believe it is in the child's best interest. They don't do it to push their authority. They don't do it to be mean. They do it because they believe that it is in the best interest of the child. So when that mother says there's no dessert until you've finished your vegetables, that mother is doing that because they know that it's in the best interest of the child to make sure that they get the vegetables which they need for that nutrients. It's in their best interest. So even though the child may not want to do it, the parent is going to force them because it is in their best interest. That's paternalism in its primary case. Now, in the business world, this carries over to where the professional is the parent and the client is the child. And many times it seems that the professional will force or impose their will upon that client. But again, they're not doing it as a sense of power pushing. They're not doing it because they want to be mean. They're doing it because they believe it's honestly in the best interest of that client. So that's paternalism. And again, that's a term you're going to see quite often. All right. So looking at the article from Richard Wasserstrom, which was, again, starting on page 58, he talks about the role of lawyers. And he says that when we look at the lawyer, the relationship that exists between the lawyer and the client, there seems to be two basic things that we can consider. First, he says there's a criticism that centers around the lawyer's stance towards the world at large. The accusation is that the lawyer-client relationship renders the lawyer at best systematically amoral, and at worst more than occasionally immoral in his or her dealings with the rest of mankind. So when people talk about and complain about lawyers, one of the things that they discuss is the fact that that lawyer's relationship with us is one that seems to be perhaps immoral or perhaps amoral. We get a lot of jokes about the sleazy lawyer, right? The ambulance chaser who is simply out to make a fast buck. And I'm sure there are some lawyers who are like that out there, but there are others who, firmly stand up for what they believe in and are acting on behalf of the law and trying to see justice done and make the world a better place too. But the fact is that when we look at that lawyer, the lawyer many times in the pursuit of their job has to do things that people looking from the outside might say, this doesn't seem right. This seems morally wrong to me. In the first case that we're going to look at, the lawyer is debating, am I going to take an alleged victim? Am I going to put that person on the stands? Am I going to try to demean their character and rake them out over the coals? Or am I going to say, I think this person's been through enough. I don't want to put them through that. Well, the lawyer most likely, if it's a defense attorney, is going to end up putting that alleged victim on the stands and trying to demean their character, trying to show some culpability on their part in the interest of their client's case. Now, people looking at the world from the outside are going to look at that and they're going to say, well, that lawyer must clearly be immoral How can he put this person through that? How can he make this person endure more, than what they've already endured? But actually, according to Wasserstrom, that lawyer probably isn't an immoral person. We see it as immoral because we are looking from the outside in. We have done something that you're not allowed to do in the court of law, and that is to prejudge the case. In our mind, we've already decided that the defendant is guilty. We've already decided that this alleged victim is not alleged. They really are a victim. And so we are looking out for that victim's interests because we've prejudged the case. But that's not the lawyer's job. The job of the prosecuting attorney is to prosecute the case to the very best of their ability. The job of the defending attorney is to defend the case to the very best of their ability. If either side fails to do that, there's a potential that the whole case could get thrown out. And if that happens, justice definitely isn't going to be served. And so it may well be that that lawyer is a person of very good moral character. Maybe they are concerned with that moral belief in justice. But they know that the best way for justice to be served is to have all of the information come out so that the jury can make a correct decision. And that's not going to happen if the lawyer picks and chooses, if the lawyer says, oh, I've already decided this person's guilty, so I'm not going to help them. It can't work that way. And so we may see the lawyer's action as being immoral. But in actuality, maybe that lawyer is a moral person. The alternative is maybe the lawyer is amoral. Maybe they stand outside of morality altogether. In other words, this lawyer might be a perfectly good, upstanding member of society, but they walk into that courtroom, and when they hang their hat and coat up at the beginning of the day, they have to hang up their morals too. They walk into that courtroom and they do a job in the way that it must be done. At the end of the day, they pick up their hat, their coat, and their morals and walk on about their business. Perhaps that's the way it works. I prefer the first scenario. I prefer to believe that the lawyer is someone who is interested in the higher order of justice, but understanding how the justice system works, realizes that each side has to do their job to the very best of their ability. And that means sometimes doing things that people in the outside world might consider to be morally disagreeable, might consider to be morally wrong. But in actuality, maybe they're not. Maybe it is the right course of action, as long as justice is served. Because, let's face it, maybe it seems on the surface like this person is guilty and the victim shouldn't have to endure, but maybe by putting that victim on the stands and making them relive certain things or raising certain questions, you're going to end up getting more information that says, hey, maybe my client isn't guilty. If you prejudge the case, maybe this person is going to go down for something he didn't actually do. So it seems that there has to be, if not a double standard altogether, at least the idea of an amorality. But I think that, essentially there is that double standard that's in place, that the lawyer operates one way on the job, operates a different way in their everyday life, as do many others. And while it may not be the ideal that we would hope for, it seems like for some careers, particularly that of a lawyer, there's no other way around it. The other criticism that he raises, he says the second criticism focuses upon the relationship between the lawyer and the client. Here the charge is that it's the lawyer-client relationship that's morally objectionable, because it's a relationship in which the lawyer dominates and in which the lawyer typically, and perhaps inevitably, treats the client in both an impersonal and paternalistic fashion. Well, that's the other criticism, is that the lawyer-client relationship seems to be one that is very paternalistic. The lawyer is a person who has great knowledge in their field, certainly more than the client does. That's why the clients come to them in the first place. They are a professional, which means they work with their mind rather than their hands, and this brings a certain sense of arrogance to a lot of people to think in those terms. The lawyer, therefore, is going to most likely take on that paternalistic stance and say, look, here's what I need you to do. Here's the way I want you to do it. Here's the way you need to dress. All right. But again, like in that paternalistic sense, the lawyer is not doing it just for the sake of a power trip. They're doing it because it's in your best interest. Knowing the ins and outs of the law, they know the best way for you to dress when you walk into that courtroom. They know the best way for you to speak and address address the jury. They know how to handle things in the way that's going to be to your best interest. And so just as that mother is saying you've got to eat your spinach, the lawyer is going to say you've got to present your case in this way. And again, they're imposing their will, and maybe it's not what you want any more than it's what the child wants. But they're doing it because they honestly believe that it's in your best interest. We need to realize that the lawyer's job, as Wasserstrom says, is to put the interests of their client first. So if you are the prosecutor, you put the interests of the state first. If you are the defendant, you put the defense attorney, you put the interest of your client first. You don't put the interests of the world first. You put the interests of your case, your client, first and foremost. And again, that's very much like a parent too. I mean, imagine you've got a group of children playing out in the street, and you see some madman racing down the road. You're going to try to get all those kids to safety, but you're going to make very sure you get your own kids to safety. You're going to put the interest of your child first. And that's what the lawyer is going to do. They're going to put the interest of their client before that of clients in general, before that of people in general. And that may seem wrong to some people, but again, given the way that the legal system works, it's the way it has to be done. Both sides have to do their job to the very best of their ability. Otherwise, justice is not going to be served. And of course, we know the system isn't perfect, but it's the best we can get. And if people started prejudging cases, and making their minds up before they ever went in and said, I'm not going to defend this person, or I'm not going to prosecute very hard because I don't think they deserve to go down, justice isn't going to be served that way. It's only served by both sides doing their job to the best of their ability. And part of that seems to mean that the lawyer has to impose their will on the client, whether the client likes it or not. Now, Wasserstrom says again that, well, maybe this isn't the ideal, maybe this isn't the perfect way that things should be, but it seems to be the way it has to be right now. And I don't know of any way of being able to change that. Maybe the lawyer could spend a little bit more time explaining to the client why they want them to do things a certain way or present their case in this way or whatever. But how many times do lawyers really have the time for something like that? And how long do the clients really want to sit there and listen? So it seems that there does have to be that double standard of sorts in the legal system. It seems like the lawyer does have to act differently on the job than they probably would in their everyday life. It seems like the lawyer does need to act in a paternalistic fashion towards their clients. And it doesn't seem like there's any alternative or change to that way of doing things. Now, if we turn to the next two articles that I wanted to look at, these are very nice to look at together because they reference each other. They give you alternative viewpoints, basically. Now, Albert Carr is going to be an advocate for what many people call game ethics. And that's simply this idea that we do act differently on the job than we do in our everyday life, because our job is like a game. It has a different set of rules than we use in everyday life, and we have to understand the rules that we're playing by. Gillespie, on the other hand, is going to argue that while this may be the way the world is, it's not the way it ought to be. And remember, we talked before about how in ethics, it comes down to that question of ought, right? How ought it to be? How should it be? And Gillespie believes that there should be one standard of morality that we use throughout our lives. We shouldn't have that double standard. Okay. So let's take a look on page 69. Carr writes, "The basis of private morality is a respect for truth. At the same time, most bluffing in business might be regarded simply as game strategy, much like bluffing in poker, which does not reflect on the morality of the bluffer. Henry Taylor, the British statesman, pointed out that falsehood ceases to be falsehood when it's understood on all sides that the truth is not expected to be spoken." Towards the bottom, it says, "The essential point is that the ethics of business are game ethics, different from the ethics of religion." So Carr uses this division, and he uses the terminology game ethics and religious ethics. By game ethics, he means the rules that we use while on the job. By religious ethics, he's talking about our ordinary everyday morality. He's not advocating any one specific religious view. He's just acknowledging that most ordinary morality has driven or grown in some way out of a religious background or religious belief. For example, in this country, we essentially follow a Judeo-Christian model of ethics, even though some of us might be Muslims, some of us might be Buddhists, some of us might be atheists. The fact is that we still grew up in what is essentially a Judeo-Christian culture, which means that that is the morality that we tend to follow. So that's why he uses that terminology of game ethics versus religious ethics. But if it helps, just think of it as, ethics of the job and everyday life. But he says here, in that passage that I read, he's looking at it from the standpoint of a game of poker. Because Carr says, that's what business is. It's a game. And as a game, it's there to be played and it's there to be won. Now, you can't play a game if you don't understand the rules of that game. When you sit down to play poker, part of the rules of the game to poker is bluffing. Okay? You want to maintain a poker face that people can't read so that you're able to not let away what your cards are. If you got really happy and giddy and excited every time you had a good hand, or you got really depressed and pouty every time you had a bad hand, then it would be very easy for people to tell whether or not they should bet against you or not. And so part of the game is to bluff in one way or another. And when you bluff in poker, nobody is going to say you're an immoral person for doing so, because it's part of the game, and everybody understands that. Well, likewise, Carr says that when it comes to the world of business, business too is a game. And just like any other game, it has a set of rules that you have to follow. Doesn't matter if you're playing poker or Monopoly or Tiddlywinks, before you play that game, you're going to sit down, look at the rules, and understand what those rules are, and you are expected to follow them to play the game correctly. Business is exactly the same. Business has its own set of rules. And part of the rules of business, just like with poker, is bluffing. Bluffing is part of the game. And it's simply a matter of being able to bluff better than your opponent if you want to win. And so, let's imagine you got a used car salesman. You go onto the lot to try to buy a vehicle. That used car salesman is going to try to bluff you. We've got lemon laws and things like that, so they can't lie outright, but they're going to tell you all of the good, all of the positive stuff about this vehicle. But unless you come knowledgeable and informed and asking the right questions, they're not going to tell you any of the negative stuff. because they want to put you behind the wheel of that car because that's how they make commission. And so if they bluff you into buying this vehicle, they've won. On the other hand, you have to be a knowledgeable consumer. You have to be somebody who's going to walk onto that lot knowing something about the vehicles, having done some background research, being able to ask the right questions, being able to bluff your way around so that you're not taken advantage of. Because that's how business works. It's a question of determining who is the better bluffer. And just as we wouldn't say that a person is morally wrong for bluffing in poker, we shouldn't say that a person is morally wrong if they bluff in the realm of business. As long as what they've done isn't illegal, then there's nothing wrong with it, according to Albert Carr's position. Bluffing ceases to be bluffing if it's understood on all sides that the truth is not expected to be spoken. So once everybody understands what the rules are and that bluffing are part of the rules, then bluffing is the way the game is meant to be played. And to not do so is going to put yourself at a terrible disadvantage. And I think that's an important thing to consider too, is that even if you want to be, like Gillespie is going to say, if you want to be a good, upright, moral person, many times in the world of business, if you are, you're going to be taken advantage of. You're going to lose out because you're not willing to get your hands dirty, because you're not willing to play the game. Carr says, play the game. That's the way to win. That's the point of any game, is to win. And you win by being the better bluffer. Carr's article is made up of a lot of different examples, and we'll just look at a couple. At the top of page 70, it says, this applicant was given a psychological test which included the statement of the following magazines: check any that you've read regularly or from time to time, double check those that interest you the most. There's a list of magazines there. His taste in reading were broad. At one time or another he had read almost all of these magazines, but he had a shrewd suspicion that if he confessed to an interest in Ramparts and the New Republic, he would be thought a liberal, a radical, or at least an intellectual, and his chances of getting the job, which he needed, would greatly diminish. He therefore checked 5 of the more conservative magazines. Apparently it was a sound decision, for he got the job. So this guy goes in for a position that's obviously a more conservative position, maybe in a bank or something like that. And all of these jobs that you go for now, they're going to give you some kind of psychological exam. Well, these psychological exams, in many cases, are a bluff. They are making it appear like the company cares about you. They're making it appear like the company wants to get to know you. But actually, all this really is to find out whether or not you're smart enough to give them what they want. Do you know how to be a yes man? That's really what this guy is proving. The question is talking about these magazines. The company could care less what magazines you read. The company doesn't care, what your personal interests or tastes are. And so by being honest in that particular case, it wouldn't have served any purpose. It would have probably lost him the position. But by answering in the way he does, he says, hey, this is a conservative company. I need to show that I am a conservative-minded individual. Therefore, I'm going to tick off those boxes to show that those are the types of magazines that I read. This man has bluffed the bluffer, and because of it, he won. Simple as that. This guy, understood how to play the game. He played it, and he came out on top. Had he told the truth about this, maybe he wouldn't have got the job. Maybe he wouldn't have won. But, they were bluffing him, trying to make it seem like they cared about his interests, and he bluffed right back and proved that he could give them what they wanted. He was smart enough to understand what it is they were looking for, and he gave it to them. So he got the job. It's just simple as that. Incidentally, and this is completely on a side note here, but these psychological exams, they are troublesome. There's a lot of flaws with them. There's one that I came across not too long ago, which was basically testing to find out whether or not a person's mind, their thought pattern, was consistent. Well, here's the problem. If you answered on the questionnaire, have you ever stolen from your company? Yes. Would you ever steal from your company again? Yes. Have you ever been convicted of a felony? Yes. If you answered questions in that fashion, when the computer program that was grading this thing brought it back, it said this person is a good hire because their mind pattern is consistent. I don't know that you want somebody who is openly admitting that they have committed a felony, that they would do it again, that they would steal from the people they worked for again, having done it the first time. I'm not sure that's the kind of person you really want to hire. But yet, the thing was programmed in such a way that that's kind of what it fed back. So watch out for those psychological exams. Try to play the game, but watch out for them. Okay. The other thing that I was going to look at is at the bottom of page 71 over onto page 72. It's a longer example, but it's one that both Carr and Gillespie touch on, because Gillespie is basically writing the article that he writes as a rebuttal of Carr. So we'll see the case, and we'll see it then from both sides. I made the mistake of telling her, his wife, that I had lunch with Colby, who gives me about half of my business. Colby mentioned that his company had a stake in the election. Then he said, by the way, I'm treasurer of the Citizens Committee for Lang. I'm collecting contributions. Can I count on you for $100? Well, there I was. I was opposed to Lang, but I knew Colby. If he withdrew his business, I could be in a bad spot. So I just smiled and wrote out the check then and there. He thanked me, and we started to talk about his next order. Maybe he thought I shared his political views. If so, I wasn't going to lose any sleep over it. I should have had enough sense not to tell Mary about it. She hit the ceiling. She said that she was disappointed in me. She said I hadn't acted like a man, that I should have stood up to Colby. I said, look, it was an either-or situation. I had to do it or risk losing the business. She came back at me with, well, I don't believe it. You could have been honest with him. You could have said you didn't feel you ought to contribute to a campaign for a man you weren't going to vote for. I'm sure he would have understood. I said, Mary, you're a wonderful woman, but you're way off the track. Do you know what would have happened if I had said that? Colby would have smiled and said, oh, I didn't realize, forget it. But in his eyes from that moment on, I'd be an oddball, maybe a bit of a radical. And he would have listened to me talk about his order. He would have promised to give it consideration. After that, I wouldn't hear from him for a week. Then I'd telephone and learn from his secretary that he wasn't yet ready to place the order. And in about a month, I would hear through the grapevine that he was giving his business to another company. A month after that, I'd be out of a job. She went silent for a moment and said, Tom, something's wrong with business when a man is forced to choose between his family's security and his moral obligation to himself. It's easy for me to say that you should have stood up to him, but if you had, you might have felt you were betraying me and the kids. I'm sorry that you did it, Tom, but I can't blame you. Something is wrong with business. In that example, Tom is taking Carr's position, and Mary is taking Gillespie's position. For Tom, this was simply a matter of knowing how to bluff to win. He did what he had to do. For Mary, like Gillespie, she feels that what took place here is wrong, and that no one should ever be put in that situation. I mean, essentially, Tom recognizes that he is a business owner, and as such, he has an obligation to himself, to his employees, to his family, to keep that business running and afloat. Now, when this guy Colby, who brings him half of his business, comes forward and says, hey, I'm collecting money for this political campaign. Could you give us $100? Tom doesn't think twice about it. He just writes out the check, hands it over. Colby understands that his business is crucial to Tom's well-being, and he is using that. He is using that knowledge to get the political contribution that he's after. He doesn't know, and he doesn't care, really, whether or not Tom is a supporter of this candidate. His job is simply to get the political contribution. And so he uses the fact of how important he is to Tom's company in order to get that contribution. So he is, in a sense, kind of bluffing Tom. Hey, I'm going to ask you for this contribution, and he knows that what's going to be going on in Tom's mind. If I don't do this, Colby could pull out his business. I could go under. Everybody could suffer. So I better just do it. And that's the process that Tom uses. Again, Tom knows he's not going to vote for this guy, and that's what really matters. He knows that if he really felt bad for it, he could always give his candidate $200 to counterbalance it. He knows $100 isn't going to do that much in a political campaign. So he bluffs back by handing over the check without a second thought or a second word. And so what happens? Business carries on as normal. But the fear, of course, was, as was pointed out, that, if he hadn't done this, Colby perhaps would have taken his business elsewhere, and his whole business, Tom's whole business, could have went under, affecting a lot of people, including his family. So he did what he had to do. He played the game. Now again, Tom probably, like Carr, wouldn't think badly about doing so. He understands that this is simply the way that the business world works. It's how business is handled. But his wife feels that this is troublesome. Why should a man be put in a situation where he has to make a choice between doing what he believes is morally right and taking care of his family? By her way of thinking, Colby should have never even asked for this contribution. This is not the sort of thing that should have taken place within a business meeting. Business should have stayed as business, and that should have been an extracurricular activity. As Tom says, Mary's kind of naive. Gillespie's kind of naive too, in that respect. Because what Mary and Gillespie are going to be looking for is to say, look, I want to have one moral standard that I can be consistent with throughout my entire life. But Tom, being the practical person like Carr, realizes that that's not the way the world works. The way that the business world works is that you have to sometimes do things that maybe don't seem right under the moment. But as long as they're legal, they're okay. And, knowing how to bluff and playing the game to win, that's what matters. And so again, for Carr, not only is it the case that there is this double standard between game ethics and religious ethics, but there also has to be. It's the way the world works, and it's the way things ought to be. But Norman Chase Gillespie, in his article starting on page 72, is going to challenge that view. He's going to say, no, absolutely not. Under no circumstances should we be put in that type of situation. No one should ever have to choose between their family's well-being and their moral beliefs. Colby should have never asked. Gillespie believes that there should be one moral standard that we follow. Now, what does that mean? Well, does that mean we follow a basic Judeo-Christian viewpoint? Does it mean that we adopt the ethics of Kant? Does it mean we adopt the ethics of Habermas or whoever? Sure. But whatever our view is, we need to remain consistent with it. We shouldn't hang it up at the beginning of the day, go on and do our job, and then pick it up at the end of the day. That's not the way the world should be. Might be the way the world is, but it's not the way it should be. And again, ethics, he reminds us, is always about ought and the way things ought to be, not necessarily the way that they are. And so he's going to argue that, yeah, we need to recognize that business is business, but we need to be able to maintain a basic moral standard. He feels that there are going to be, like with everything, certain exceptions to the rule. There are certain exceptions that we have to consider. And so here on page 74, he gives us these three exceptions. The first one, sometimes the moral cost of obeying a standard moral rule is too great, so one must make an exception to that rule. If the only way to save someone's life is by telling a lie, then one should normally lie. So if the moral cost of obeying the rule is too great, we should not obey it. He uses the example of lying or deceiving. Normally speaking, we should have a basic rule, a basic policy that it is morally wrong to tell a lie, that truthfulness, that honesty is what is warranted. And that would, of course, mean that, perhaps in the world of business, that there should not be bluffing taking place, lying or deception taking place. But he says there are going to be some instances where maybe it is necessary. If the only way to save somebody's life is by telling a lie, then it's probably right in that circumstance to tell a lie, to make an exception to the rule. So imagine there's an accident that's taken place out in the street and somebody is lying there, they've lost a limb and they're bleeding out. If that person is conscious enough to ask you and say, what's going on? What's my condition? You probably shouldn't be completely honest with them. Say, hey, sorry, you've lost your arm. Because if you do that, the shock under their present situation could potentially kill them. Instead, you know that your job is to calm them, to keep them in a steady state until the paramedics can come. They can find out the worst later on, but your job is to try to keep them alive. And if that means that you deceive them, withhold information from them, then that's exactly what you're going to do. That doesn't mean that you should go around lying and deceiving people all the time. But in that particular circumstance, where telling the truth to that person could potentially send them into shock and kill them, it's better off to deceive them and keep them alive. They'll find out the truth soon enough. So there are exceptions to the rule, but that doesn't mean that we need a whole different code of ethics that we follow. It's just, again, we're looking at it from the standpoint of my basic rule is don't lie, but here is an exception to that rule. And you'll notice it's a pretty extreme exception. It's when somebody's life is on the line. The second way in which an ordinary duty may cease to be a duty is when the cost to the individual fulfilling that duty is too high. So if it's going to cost somebody else their life, that was the first reason why you might change that rule, make an exception. The second is if it applies to you. If the cost of obeying that rule is too great to me, then I probably shouldn't obey it. If it's going to cost me my life to obey this rule, then I probably shouldn't obey it. So, imagine yourself driving down some twisty, turny, windy West Virginia highway, and you've got a semi-truck coming up the road one direction. There's another big truck coming behind you the way you're going, and you lose your brakes. There's a car in front of you. Ordinarily, it would be considered morally wrong of you to bump into the car in front of you. But if you stop and consider the other options, if you swerve one direction, you're going to end up going head on into a semi-truck 90 miles an hour. There's going to be an explosion and you're dead. If you swerve the other way to avoid hitting that car, you're going to fall 1,000 feet down the side of a mountain. The car is going to explode and you're going to be dead. Now, if you keep moving forward potentially bumping the car in front of you, at least you're both going in the same direction. And if you're honking and flashing your lights, maybe they can, do something about it themselves. But the point is that it would not be right to do this under normal circumstances. But in this rare instance, we can make an exception to the rule, because doing anything other than bumping the vehicle in front of you is going to lead pretty much to certain death for you, if not others as well. I mean, because the truck driver might get killed too when the car explodes from hitting the thing head on. So that's another exception to the rule. Now, those two exceptions, I think, do make a lot of sense. If it's going to cost somebody else their life, don't do it. If it's going to cost you your life, don't do it. The third exception is where on the surface, it kind of seems like he blows it. The third way in which a normal duty may turn out not to be a duty is the kind of situation described by Yossarian. If everyone else is not doing what ought to be done, then one would be a fool to act differently. In other words, if nobody else is obeying the rule, you shouldn't either. That seems to be something that's flying right back to Carr's position, doesn't it? It makes it seem like now he's not saying anything different than what Carr's doing. He's undermining his own position, it seems like. Because isn't that all that happened in the case with Tom and Colby? Right? Other people in the world of business are bluffing. If I don't bluff too, then I'm going to be put at a serious disadvantage. So I better bluff. If everybody else isn't doing what should be done, why should I? It seems like he blows his case, but here's why he doesn't. What he's actually saying is this: he's being practical. He understands that the world is a certain way, and that we have to operate within the world the way that it is right now. But he also says that what we need to do is to find a way around that. We need to work towards the change that's necessary in order to fix the problem. The way the world is not the way it ought to be. We can't change it overnight, and we certainly can't change it as an outsider. So we have to do what is necessary to keep ourselves alive and viable within that business so that we can work from within for its change to make the world the way it ought to be. And that's why Gillespie says what he says with this third exception. He's not agreeing with Carr. He's not saying that the moral conventionalism is a positive, good thing that we should embrace. He's opposed to it. He hates moral conventionalism. But at the same time, he's practical enough to realize that if I want to see that change to where we can operate from a single code of ethics, where I don't have to be bluffing all of the time, if I can manage to do that, I have to do it from within. So I have to perhaps do what I don't want to do and bluff others. I may have to get my hands dirty and play the game simply to stay alive within that business world. Because nobody's going to listen to somebody from the outside saying, hey, change everything that you've ever known. That change has to come from within. And so that person, like Gillespie, wants to say, look, I'm going to play this dirty game if I have to stay alive, but I'm going to be working all of the time that I'm doing it to try to change it so I don't have to. I want to move away from this double standard towards being able to have a singular code of ethics for us to follow. We don't need two standards of morality. We can follow one, recognizing that there are a few exceptions to any rule. But generally speaking, I want to do what is morally correct, and I want to know what that is. You know, the simple fact is, according to Gillespie, and there's probably some truth to this, that if you maintain a double standard long enough to where here's what I do on the job, here's what I do in my everyday life, if I maintain that double standard long enough, they're going to start to meld together. But when that happens naturally, it's probably not the business ethics that improves to become like our everyday morality, but it's our everyday morality that starts to sink into the business ethics. And before long, we find that what we're doing, we're bluffing, not just in poker, not just on the used car lot, but we're bluffing in our everyday life too. We're lying and deceiving people in our everyday life too. Because it's very hard to maintain that two standards of morality. We're going to naturally want to migrate towards one. But we don't very seldom elevate ourselves. We tend to debase ourselves. And so before long, we're acting just as badly in our everyday life as we are in the world of business. And that's why he feels that we need to make that move. We need to make that transition. I used the term moral conventionalism earlier, and Gillespie also uses that term, so I should probably give you that as well. Moral conventionalism. Moral conventionalism, at least in the way that it's used in the text here, says that whatever has become acceptable within the realm of business is morally right. So morality is a constantly changing idea, and it's one that basically is going to alter or change as the community or society of business changes. But once something has become accepted within the way things are done, there's no need to think about it any further. So as soon as it becomes accepted to bluff in business, bluffing in business becomes the right course of action. And that's what's meant by moral conventionalism. So we can see that Carr's position is one that opposes the idea of moral conventionalism, whereas Gillespie's view is one that so the Carr's position embraces moral conventionalism. Gillespie's is one that opposes it. Okay. Ultimately, you can decide for yourself where you stand on this particular issue and whether or not you think that there should be this double standard in play, or whether you think that Gillespie's right and we should be trying to move towards a singular code of ethics. We will talk more about this role differentiation when we get into the discussion for case 1. And basically there it kind of goes back to the lawyer question that we were looking at earlier. And we have to decide whether or not that lawyer is going to place the alleged victim on the stands and try to demean their character. What course of action are they going to take? What type of morality are they going to use? So it should be a fun first discussion. So everybody should, before we get to that, we do have one more lecture before we get to the first discussions. But make sure that you've read through that case discussion as well as case discussion 2 before we get to that point. So you got a good idea of what it is that we're discussing. All right. So that's it for today. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to email. And of course, you can also ask when we go live on Thursday. And we'll see you next time.